Hey, hello, we are here to wrap up July reading, but if you will indulge me in some housekeeping notes up front, I'd appreciate it. First, if you have noticed, it rained this weekend and cooled down a little bit, so we are taking a break from the dreaded summer white wall. Second of all, if you hear any noise come through, particularly coughing, I do have a neighbor who has started to stand outside my window and smoke like every day and hack, and it is my own personal telltale heart, I think. But regardless, we're just gonna muster through. But in the spirit of wrapping up July reading, I also hit 1,000 subscribers and monetization in July. And I would just like to thank you all for that and the support, whatever that means to you, whether it be popping into my videos every once in a while, liking, subscribing, commenting. I appreciate it all. I know that there are a lot of people on YouTube, a lot of readers on YouTube, and to have anyone interested in what I have to say about books and joining in that conversation with me is a huge gift, and I recognize that. I thank you for allowing me to have this space to just kind of babble into the void. It's appreciated, you're appreciated, and I just wanted to thank you all again for being here. Additionally, in the last month, we have seen SAG join the WGA strike, and this is another thing I posted on my community tab, but in case you're not there, because I'm never going to take for granted your time, that means I have halted all discussion of book-to-screen adaptations until the resolution of the strike. I know there has been a lot of conversation regarding continuing these discussions or whether these discussions should have even continued after WGA went on strike. And I did reach out to one of my friends who I believe he's either in the union or eligible for the union, aiming to be in the union. I have a lot of friends that are in this industry. I went to theater school and by nature of that have a lot of friends tangentially related to these industries that I care about. So I obviously care about the issues that are on the table here for creatives and everyone involved in a production. And so I had reached out at the beginning of the WGA strike, and at the time the consensus to my viewing of it seemed to be that it was okay to talk about projects that had already been completed. However, with the addition of SAG into the strike, it limits promotion for projects for actors. And additionally, the union has asked for people to stop posting content, even organically, that will promote these productions that are not paying their creatives and everyone involved in the production fairly. And so with that and the proper amount of reality and humbleness here, I recognize that my videos really aren't probably moving the needle anywhere, but that's not what it's about. It's about, especially now with monetization, not collecting even the pennies on the videos about these works when the creatives behind it may not even be getting those pennies, and it's respecting the work and making sure that those behind the work are properly compensated. So I, of course, want to be nerding out about these projects with you. I was obviously looking forward to it, but until resolutions have been reached with these unions, I won't be talking about these projects. What we are not on hiatus with, which also can't be taken for granted after last year's HarperCollins strike, and I don't want to forget or want us to forget how long that dragged on either, but we're still reading books, right? So I read around 10-ish books in July, I think, which for me this year seems to be a good base or average to have in a month. I have talked about some of these titles during Feature Friday. Obviously, I have not talked about all of them during Feature Friday, and you have maybe noticed, if you are around a lot, that I have skipped some Fridays this month, and we'll see how August goes as well. I may just kind of step back a little bit to focus on the reading. I needed a kind of mood reader recalibration set there, and so I took it. I just needed a couple weeks where I didn't have to think as hard, or I didn't have to have opinions, I should say. And we may circle back to that discussion and the idea of reviewing and what readers owe authors in the coming weeks, but not today. And so if you have been around this month for Feature Fridays, those that happened, I started the month off with Happy Place by Emily Henry. Now, I know there are very strong opinions about Emily Henry. People have like camps within Emily Henry's like adult romances, in the sense that I've seen people lump book lovers and beach read together and People You Meet on Vacation and Happy Place together. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, I have not read People You Meet on Vacation yet, though I have my mom's book of the month copy sitting on my shelf right now. And so I went into Happy Place expecting it to be a little bit sadder of a book, and it definitely was. I think that this further cemented for me this kind of in-between that Emily Henry is living in terms of she's still being marketed as romance, but for me as a reader, she much more feels like what would have once been categorized as women's fiction, which I think is reductive in a way. We've had these conversations before. This book and her books, I think, are exploring their experiences for all people. However, this was very much kind of sitting on that precipice of adolescence and adulthood, but like later adolescence, right? This idea of having to step into adulthood and how you grow and change and what that means for the friendships and groups that you formed at an earlier stage in your life, even if you still love those people, but how everyone is growing and changing in slightly different ways and how that upsets the dynamic, and this idea of clinging to what once was and what that means. And so there's this kind of nostalgia and sadness tinged to everything here. And when I reviewed it, I did mention too this idea of the kind of toxic positivity that lived in the book and existed in the beginning because we were following Harriet try to recenter herself, take herself to her happy place in preparation for meeting her friends at this annual vacation spot that they had been going to since college. But this year she was going to have to prep to tell them or not that she had broken up from her long-term fiance that she had been dating since college and is part of the friend group. But when she gets there, she is surprised by her friends who have brought Wynne to this vacation as well, because they thought that they were just being separated by Harriet's job at a hospital and Wynne having to go back home to take care of his mother. And so they thought they were doing a surprise for their friends. And while initially Harriet and Wynne are trying to gauge when they're going to have to break the news to their friends, then another couple in the friend group announces their own engagement and surprise wedding at this place because it's the last summer they're going to be here. They're also given the news that this home away from home for them has been sold, that one of the group's parents has sold this vacation home and this is their last summer there. And so they are celebrating this last summer together, this new marriage of another couple in the friend group, and they decide that they can't ruin these last moments with this news. But then they're also circling each other the whole time. Harriet is trying to gauge where the end of their relationship came, and it's really digging into and circling back to kind of this idea of toxic positivity again, though it never calls it on its face that, but just the concept of happy place, because it is obviously this place where they all get to be together and they kind of get to live in this liminal space outside of the real world and their real problems, but it's also this place of change and growth where they're having to launch themselves into their adulthood in new ways and leave these former versions of themselves behind. And the way that this idea of happy place, whether it's this physical place and how they interact with each other within this space, or Harriet trying to kind of bury down some of these more complicated, sadder feelings with this idea of being happy and kind of going back and looking at where this relationship began and having that contrasted with where they are now and looking at that before as the happy place within the narrative. And so our characters are doing a lot of hiding over the course of the book, and the narrative is really structured around tearing all of that away. And it's about these characters facing these messier emotions. And obviously Harry and Wynne's relationship is kind of the center of everything narratively here, but I would argue that it's not the complete driver of everything. It's very much driven by Harry and to a certain point the entire group. And so while their relationship is central to things, it's very much more, I would argue, about Harry and even Wynne's internal lives and kind of having to face up to this next chapter and communicate and look at what they want out of life and the realities of knowing that this person that you care for and have grown with means so much to you, but are they compatible with the future you are envisioning for yourself? And what does it mean when where you see your future going is kind of a nightmare for your partner? And what are those sacrifices that are made? What are those compromises that are made? And what happens when you're not communicating through that the whole time and just making sacrifices without talking to the other person, even if they are sacrifices that are made because you love them, but but the way it can kind of start to eat at you. So there are just a lot of layers here, and everything is tinged by this regret and this sadness in a way. And it's kind of quintessential nostalgia because it's that looking back on the glory days, on this happiness, and trying to recapture that magic and forcing something into a shape that doesn't fit anymore. Now, I would argue that the pacing isn't completely perfect here. There are times that the structure and the form of it kind of kept me as a reader at a distance until the kind of emotional reckoning of it, but it still ultimately did move me into tears in the most literal fashion. So I think it was a really interesting book, and I think it's really interesting in kind of looking at what I think Henry is trying to do and explore with her work right now. In that way too, I definitely understand why this one was released in hardcover. That was kind of a big conversation when it was first announced because her other books so far have been paperbacks. And before I argued too that, especially in the 2000s, when you saw a romance author reach a certain amount of acclaim and popularity, they would move those books into hardcover. However, I think here it's a little bit of that, trying to kind of gauge out that earlier model when publishers seem so unclear on what models they're kind of pursuing right now, especially in romance, where they're trying to push everything into trade paperback. And as you know, a traditional long-standing romance reader, I personally don't necessarily always want to pay trade paperback prices for books, but they're really reaching out to a lot of new romance readers with that. I don't know, again, larger conversations we've touched on before. However, I think that moving this into hardcover was a little bit of that popularity, but also a little bit of setting it apart because the subject matter is a little bit more sprawling in the sense that the relationship is central, but it's not the center. And in some ways that has been the case before, especially with something like Book Lovers. However, the relationship, I would argue, was still much more centered there than here. Again, it's still there, it's still important, but when we're looking at the larger structure and how everything is being put together and what exactly is being explored, I think that there's a larger exploration there as well. And then moving on, so we're not just talking about Happy Place the whole time, I read Lore Volume 4. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one, as I haven't probably since the first volume. This volume did feel like we were moving the plot along a little bit more than the last volume. Again, I am reading these with their physical releases, so I'm not as up to date with them as they are on like webtoons, but I'm very much enjoying them. Additionally, tangent kind of, you might have noticed that both on the thumbnail and so far I haven't had any physical books to like hold up or, you know, have in a thumbnail. And that's because I read, I think, all of these books either from the library and had to take them back because of due dates, or I read them on my Kobo. So that is why there is no Vanna Whiting today. I'm trying to be a little bit more fiscally responsible. Next, I listened from the library to The Wager by David Grann. This is the author of Killers of the Flower Moon, but this is a book about a shipwreck and a mutiny, and it was very much engaging. The pacing was a little wonky at times because we spent a lot of time at the beginning on the boat, and then it felt like we kind of sped through after the shipwreck and the mutiny of it all, and I found myself getting a little lost at times. And I will admit I did have trouble keeping some of the characters separate, except for Byron. There was a Byron, and it was an ancestor. Ancestor feels like a much older word than, you know, it was just like Lord Byron's, I think, grandfather. Could I tell you what his job on the ship was? Absolutely not. I could not remember anybody's jobs on the ship, but the whole concept of this book was this famous shipwreck and mutiny, but that these people, these men, had been given up for dead. They were assumed dead at sea, and then a group of them showed up somewhere. I've already forgotten where their little raft washed up. I promise I was paying attention to this. And basically they were like heralded as heroes until another group of survivors washed up and was like, hey, actually, they were involved in a mutiny. And then there was a lot at stake on who was telling the truth because the others could be punished for either a mutiny or whatever. And so there was a lot of exploration of the nature of ships at this time and the kind of hierarchy on the ship, and I really appreciated all of that. I also thought, pacing aside, that it had a really good narrative through line to it. It was very much more a kind of story that we were being told. I will say I probably will need to go back and re-listen because I didn't always hold on to all of the specifics, and since I was listening to it, I couldn't go back and kind of reference in earlier pages in the same way. While I do prefer listening to my nonfiction, there are occasionally drawbacks in this way, and it just kind of depends on what book I'm reading. So I do think in some ways that it helped it feel more like a story listening to it. It felt more like a podcast episode of it, right? But there are then the drawbacks of like, wait, who's who, and not having as much of that kind of visual cue to things. And then because I clearly wasn't done with boat books, I read Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea by Rita Chang Epig. This is a historical literary novel about a legendary Chinese pirate queen. I say historical and literary because the structure of it, while it's a short book, like I said in the Feature Friday for this one, I think classifying it as literary helps set expectations of the structure of the thing, because it is a little bit more winding, it is a little bit more reflective. It's not as propulsive as you might think when you think pirate book. You're thinking adventure story, you're thinking lots of swashbuckling, lots of fights. There are lots of fights and there is still swashbuckling, but it's much more of a kind of political intrigue. It's a little bit more of a slow burn. We're looking at the full swath of this woman's life, and we're looking at her kind of juggling some big choices amidst a period of great change, and looking at how she's navigating power and how she's come to that power. So there is a lot at play here amidst what is this really propulsive kind of environment. I'm really excited. I still need to read The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, but I'm excited to look at these two women that we've gotten this year, these two powerful pirate women, and see how these books lay against each other, because I think that they are exploring similar themes with just different vehicles narratively, and I'm really excited to see what that looks like here. But all that being said, I did really love the language here, and I did love the symbolism as well that we were exploring. This idea of this character who was reinventing herself again and again while being involved on the water in different scenarios, but this idea of rebirth, even as her symbolism and her kind of idea of reading the signs of the world and interpreting how one should move about the world was much different. So I really enjoyed being in this woman's head, and I thought it was really interesting too, because in many ways she would be considered an anti-hero of sorts, because she was making these really ruthless big decisions, but we were seeing into the interior of that. We were seeing the cost of that in some ways, but also everything that she was kind of mentally balancing. We were seeing the weight of what the choice to potentially sacrifice a bunch of men was, and watching that play out. So I enjoyed it. You know the drill. If you want a more insightful, in-depth look at that, I did a Feature Friday on it. More insightful and in-depth being relative, in the sense that definitely more than here, but surely not as insightful or in-depth as it could be, or I ultimately would like it to be. And then moving on, I read North Ranger by Ray Tercero and Brie Indigo, which is a young adult graphic novel retelling of Northanger Abbey. I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly, and I can practically hear the gnashing of the teeth of all the Jane Austen readers. I apologize. I promise I've read it, and I've actually been wanting to go back and revisit it. I've always meant to, but I've always wanted, and I still haven't read a lot of the Gothics, the really popular Gothics that inspired it, particularly like, is it Castle of Otranto? And so the gist is, in the original, this woman has read too many Gothic novels and starts like interpreting all of these things in this house with like Gothic undertones that aren't there. And here we have a young teen in Texas who is a devout scary movie fan, and he's basically been roped into helping, or working I should say, as a ranch hand for the summer at this ranch, and he gets close to the son of the owner of the ranch. And as a closeted gay teen in Texas, there is a lot of struggle there for him, especially as he is sharing a room with his stepfather this summer, and there's some tension there, especially in some of the offhanded things his stepfather says. And so he's trying to navigate this space. He's in these close quarters. He doesn't feel like he has a whole lot of autonomy, and amidst all of this, he gets a crush, and his mind starts going wild when he starts hearing rumors from another ranch hand about his crush and his crush's mom, who recently passed away, and that whole scenario. So I think it handles the kind of idea of a teen crush, this idea of kind of working for the summer. It handles so much so well, and I thought it was a really great interpretation of the original while still really tapping in to a lot of conversations and feelings for teens today. And then I read The Bride by Julie Garwood, because this month I revisited some kind of quintessential Julie Garwoods for me after she had passed away in, I believe, June. and I did a whole video about kind of revisiting Julie Garwood because she's really the author who got me into historical romance. And so The Bride ended up being the Garwood I remember. Like, if you had asked me prior to these rereads what a Julie Garwood book was, it would be The Bride. It involved, you know, this woman in this kind of arranged marriage and going to this Scottish keep, and she is a healer and she kind of has to win over this group. There's that tension between the Scottish and the English. There is this outside instigator kind of villain force that we get a voice from, but we don't know who it is. There's a lot of outside instigations and kind of outside happenings, and it feels a little bit more slapdash in some ways, in the sense that there's like lots of things being thrown in at this couple from the outside. It's got plucky heroines, it's got lots of banter in a different way than something like a Julia Quinn, but nevertheless you can see it there. You've got these fiery heroines kind of going toe to toe with their love interests, and there's just a lot of heart there. Does everything hold up? Absolutely not. Does it feel like something's moved really quick? Yes, but there's still a lot of charm there, and a lot of it holds up a lot better than I expected a romance that's what, like 40 years old at this point to hold up. And then in between my Julie Garwoods, because you know I didn't read just one, I listened to something much less romantic. I listened to Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. This is the author of Evicted, which I am ashamed to say I still haven't read, but this book is looking at the concept of poverty, specifically in America, and this idea of generational poverty, how poverty serves the political system, a lot of different facets. It is kind of sweeping and generalized while still being pretty specific. I definitely want to revisit it. It was not surprising and utterly wrecking at the same time. In college, I did a sociology kind of capstone project where I got to sit in on a sociology 400 class as a sophomore, and we were doing a kind of look at Middletown because I went to school in the town the Middletown study was originated in. And so we were looking at it for the current day and doing ethnographic research and writing a play. And so that's where I first came across like really involved conversations about informed consent and really this idea of protecting the integrity of a thing. Like, we had conversations in the script writing room about how we couldn't cut specific quotes from people, specific interviews in particular ways because it undermined or maybe got at a different point than the original speaker was trying to make. Even if it wasn't in opposition with that original point, it was about reflecting the voice accurately and how everyone had to be fully informed about what was going on. And so it was a real look at that. But in part of that, we partnered with a program called Bridges Out of Poverty, and we got to sit in on some of their sessions, and we had one of their representatives come and talk to us. And so this is a program, and I don't know everything about it, to be fair, where we were kind of educated on the mindset of poverty and this idea of how poverty is seen, how poverty is taught, but especially how poverty moves through generations and kind of the psychology of poverty. This idea that we can look at someone in poverty and judge them for going out and buying this brand new TV when they get a sudden windfall of money. And I think we saw a lot of those conversations just 3 years ago. But for someone who doesn't know where their next paycheck is coming from, that new TV represents like guaranteed entertainment. And just this idea of how money management is taught and conceived of differently. Circling back to one of the books I talked about last month, one of the things that really got me in The Dream, the podcast, the anti-MLM podcast, is that because it was a very well done podcast, they brought on a really high up representative of the MLM company 31. And she is a very successful rep. And the way she was talking about getting customers and this idea, reiterating this idea of people who are living in poverty maybe want to splurge on the big thing when they have the money, and her kind of talking about using that sales strategy. But it made me think of this Bridges Out of Poverty program, because this program partnered with business leaders in the community to kind of give the person working to get out of this generational poverty and just learn how to reconceive of money in a different way, a mentor, someone they could go to, someone they could talk to, because part of it is that you just haven't been taught these things, right? And you don't have anyone that you can go to and ask questions, especially 10 years ago. The kind of landscape of these conversations was a lot different. And when I was listening to that podcast from this particular representative, I was hearing a lot of echoes of this program, and I was seeing someone who had been given this knowledge of how people who are struggling with poverty function, and then was using that knowledge to exploit them. And that is part of why I really, really dislike that business structure. So anyway, I think this is a really important book. It's really compelling, if ultimately really upsetting. It is also short though, so it packs a lot into a little bit of space. And it's not just data, it really makes it personal. He is talking about people that he interacted with, especially when researching Evicted, and his own personal life, and just the way he has seen people navigate poverty in this country, and then paints it into the bigger picture, which I think is really important in terms of giving something a face. So it's not just this kind of ephemeral idea that you can then ignore. And then we'll swing back to Julie Garwood, because while important and definitely needs to be explored and stressed, we can't live in that all the time. And so I read The Secret by Julie Garwood, which is the book I'm going to be reading for my romance book club. And at the time that I read The Bride, and I talked about this in my Julie Garwood video as well, so apologies for reiterating if you did watch that video. But when I read The Bride, I was like, oh, okay, well, this is the quintessential Julie Garwood. So why did I like The Secret better when I'm looking back at like my ratings of these books, my original ratings, which is also interesting because when I reread the Bridgerton series, a lot of my ratings flipped on the extremes. So like when I was a teenager, Benedict's book was one of my favorites, and I didn't like Antony's book as much according to my ratings. But when I revisited them as an adult, it was the exact opposite. So it's very interesting to see how something that feels like it should be stagnant, because my tastes haven't really changed too much in what I gravitate to in romance, or at least I didn't think they had, but like what that added perspective gives you. And also, again, just how far we've come since the 30 or 40 years ago that these books were written. And it hurts me just as much as it hurts you to say that these books were written 30 or 40 years ago. Believe you me. But The Secret, while it doesn't have that marriage of convenience kind of outset like The Bride does, which I have said before I really gravitate to, it does have a marriage early enough in it that we do get to see them navigate that marriage a little bit, and we see that attraction between our two leads early on. And there is, of course, as the title suggests, because we're not to the subtle age of titles here, there is this secret looming, and I really do love a good secret. I just love the way that these kind of reveals play out. And so here we have Judith, who is best friends with a woman in the clan of our hero, who is the Laird. And Judith has basically made a promise to Frances Catherine, despite the fact that Judith is English and Frances Catherine is Scottish, and their, worlds don't get along too well, but she has promised Frances Catherine, I believe it's Frances Catherine, that basically she'll help Frances Catherine through her birthing, because both Frances Catherine's mother and grandmother died in childbirth. And so Judith has no experience with the, before of the childbirth, but she has really taken this seriously and has like enlisted the help of like a bunch of midwives to gain knowledge, and has become an expert. And so she comes to help her friend, but in the meantime gains a lot of popularity in this community because the midwives in the community so far aren't too great. They really lean into the pain part of things and really see it as a power trip in some ways. And so Judith really upsets the power and the kind of natural order of this community, and kind of carves out a place for herself, even as she feels like an outsider and feels like this secret that is looming large for her, which goes back to who her father is, even though she's never met him, feels like that will force her out of the community, and it doesn't. And I really enjoyed going back to these books in context of having listened to Fated Mates talk about Julie Garwood after her passing as well, because while later in life she was really writing a lot of these like thriller, contemporary, like mystery type romances, that is not who I think of, or that is not what I think of when I think of Julie Garwood romances. I think of these historicals. And I really appreciated in Fated Mates them kind of exploring the idea that these heroines were finding community in these books as much as love, and just the way that they were able to find somewhere that they belonged. And I found that really beautiful, and I found the kind of exploration of the structure really interesting. So we've obviously come a long way in terms of romance structure but these are the kind of books that I trace all of my knowledge back to, and how I kind of conceptualize of the timeline of how we think about the plotting in romances. And I'm not super smart about it yet, and I'm not, you know, super articulate in this moment, so very interesting to kind of trace back to where I started. And again, not perfect books, really have some of the prejudices of their time, particularly in relation to ableism, to my reading of just these two books, but they also, again, hold up better than I expected them to if you were reading them through the context of their time as well. Okay, and then as you probably saw on a Feature Friday as well, I read Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, and this is an undeniably buzzy book. That feels like an understatement. As I mentioned in that video, honestly didn't think I was going to talk about it because it is so buzzy. I was like, what do I really have to add to this conversation? But there were so many conversations within that book. So I took the bait and kind of dove into some of them in that video, but it really does only scratch the surface. And that book is so short, it's kind of amazing. Having sat with it a couple of weeks now, has it been a couple of weeks? I surely don't know. I am interested in how the book reads to those not as enmeshed in especially online bookish spaces, because it is so much kind of referential to these online conversations and kind of subcultures and communities. If you're online in bookish spaces to some degree, you're aware of some, if not all, of this discourse and the references being made in this book. But I also think it's interesting because a lot of that then also plays into even the structure of the book, because you can kind of feel the kind of PR cycle of it all coming. And there's a lot really interesting in that conversation. I've gone into a lot of it, but the structure in particular I find really interesting because it wasn't perfect, I don't think, because a lot of it was this kind of like hurry up and wait because it was this literary thriller, and so there wasn't a whole lot of external action. It was a lot of reactionary moments. We were watching June react to things, which is also interesting from her as a character, right? Because she is a reactive character, and so that says something about her in and of itself. But because it's driven so much by the kind of publishing cycle and the discourse cycle, we are watching more of that reaction, and because of that the end felt a little rushed, even if it was planted earlier, and to be honest, planted pretty obviously. I think if you are aware of the discourse earlier, it still felt like we really just jumped right there at the end, and there was this effort to kind of like build up this kind of breaking of June mentally, where it felt like we were supposed to question her reality and what she was seeing, even as that didn't feel totally grounded in what we had seen so far. And it's also interesting because we do have this character that is so isolated in so many ways, and I think that is too part of the exploration of how isolated and isolating this world is in a lot of ways. Even if you think you are part of these groups, like these text groups, there are many layers to that, but because of that, it felt a lot more isolating in the narrative as well. So it was an interesting structure in some ways, and kind of circling back to this idea of how this reads to someone kind of outside of the community, I'm still very interested in that. We've seen, as I kind of discussed in the Feature Friday, this be R.F. Kuang's like biggest commercial success so far, I think, which, as discussed, makes sense in terms of like thrillers being a much more approachable genre in some ways than like high fantasy. You're gonna see a lot more people just grab it, especially at this length. But then I'm really interested again in how it reads, especially for maybe like your average voracious thriller reader who isn't really enmeshed online in these spaces. And I think that we forget quite often that not every reader is enmeshed in these online spaces, which is a part of another conversation I think I do want to have. But so it's just interesting to think of all of that together. So I think it is opening some really interesting dialogue. It has something really specific to say. I do think part of the quickness and that kind of heightened sense of everything at the end of the novel is part of the satire. It's supposed to be exaggerated. So I don't necessarily think that's a jarring choice in and of itself, but it very much is interesting to see how everything is working together. And again, I think that there's just so much conversation that can be had about this book. And then finally for the month, I read We Could Be So Good, the newest romance by Sebastian. This is looking at two newspapermen in the 50s, Nick and Andy. Nick is like a beat reporter. Is that what they call it? I surely don't know. And Andy is kind of working his way up the chain because he is the heir to this newspaper, and his father is basically training him up from the ground up with this expectation that he take over in about a year due to his father's ailing health. And Andy and Nick unexpectedly hit it off when Andy is still working on the floor in the newsroom, and this is unexpected for Nick because Andy comes from so much privilege. He doesn't expect to like him, but Andy is just so endearing. They kind of cross paths and then become this team and form this partnership in terms of reporting. The structure of this was really interesting because based on the blurb, I was expecting this to be a little bit more like enemies to lovers kind of a dynamic, because we're supposedly watching Nick kind of go against his instincts with Andy, right? But we see their friendship form very early on, and we almost start the book out with this kind of montage that gets us to the real kind of start of the book. And so we watch the friendship between Andy and Nick form. We are seeing this really from Nick's point of view. So we are watching Nick develop this crush, know that he can't do anything about it. We watch Andy start dating this woman that works at the paper as well, that Nick is friends with. She is able to recognize Nick for who he is and kind of tries to set him up with some of her friends, but all the while Nick is still grateful that because of who Andy is dating, that he'll still get to have Andy in his life as a friend despite everything, but is still kind of frustrated and navigating the changes of their friendship brought about by this engagement. And then we open the book with that engagement ending. And so Andy's fiance had an affair while she was over in London taking care of her sick mother, and when she comes back, she ends things. And this upsets Andy, and he's kind of discombobulated. He's not as heartbroken as you would expect, but he ends up moving in with Nick because it's kind of stated that Andy is kind of forgetful, and basically Nick doesn't really trust him to take care of himself. But also Andy is really lonely and craving companionship, and so he leaves this really nice apartment that he owns after his mother passed to live in a much more standard apartment with Nick. And so instead of the enemies to lovers kind of dynamic I was expecting, we definitely get a friends to lovers, and I really, really appreciated the way it was handled. Additionally, this is set in the 50s, and that is a time frame I wouldn't have voluntarily entered probably for most other authors. I really love Sebastian, despite the fact that I haven't read her two most recent works before this. Notwithstanding, I was very intrigued by this because I liked the setting of a newsroom, even if it was blurbed as for fans of Newsies, which is not the case, I would argue, because this is set in the 50s and has nothing to do with a strike. So it is following a much more progressive paper and does kind of look at the aftermath of McCarthyism and really the world it's drawing I really appreciate. Because I think so often with the 50s, we think of that kind of fantasy that was spun even at the time and after of like the Leave It to Beaver kind of thing, which was not the case. And so here we see a much more kind of accurate picture, and we see the culture and we see the counterculture, and we don't shy away from the realities of living as a gay man in the 50s and what Nick went through especially, but we also don't pretend that gay men didn't exist in the 50s because it's simply not true. And we're even looking at like the idea of community for that in the 50s and the literature that came out about gay people in the 50s, which I found really interesting because there's this common thread. There is this like subplot where Nick keeps getting sent books from one of the book editors that deal with gay themes, and he's like, I'm not reading these books anymore. He only sends me the most depressing books. And he's also kind of afraid of acknowledging it because he's afraid of being outed. And so Nick is really kind of lone wolfing it for most of this book. So as much as we talked about finding community in the Julie Garwood books, this book is about love, but also about finding community in a lot of ways as well. And so he sent this book and he's like, I'm not going to read these depressing books. They never end well. I understand why they don't end well, but I don't want to read it. And it kind of circles a lot of conversations we've had in the last 10 years to this day about how we can and do reflect queerness in literature, and this idea of this exploring and grasping on to queer joy in this book, while again not shying away from the realities. And it was really interesting to just think of the world that was drawn here, because this is undoubtedly historical fiction, but much more contemporary than I would traditionally gravitate to. So it still feels modern in some sensibilities, but there is a much slower pace to everything. The stakes are impacted by the fact that these characters can't just call each other up on their cell phones. There is a point where like Andy leaves the apartment to go somewhere and Nick is just so worried about what he's thinking and when he can see him and whatnot. And we definitely can feel that separation, that idea that we don't know what someone may be thinking when they're away from us at this time. And also just looking at the evenings for these two was so fascinating for me, because there was this beautiful kind of familiarity and closeness really communicated through painting these pictures, but just also what these two were doing at night, whether it was Nick begrudgingly ironing his laundry or Andy just like listening to a ball game on the radio while reading. It's a much slower pace. And I don't say that with any kind of like misguided nostalgia, but it definitely did leave me thinking, like even when I was a teenager, I was thinking of this recently, this idea of being able to focus on my reading a lot more because I didn't have as many distractions. And I sometimes really miss, and I've had it a couple times recently, but just what was such a common occurrence at that time of like sitting down to read a book and looking up and hours have passed, I feel like it's much different now because there are so many distractions and I'm constantly kind of chasing that. But I ultimately was really surprised by how much I enjoyed the setting of this. I will say the structure, there was some outside plotting that seemed like it was going to be much more important than it was, and it was tied up a little too neatly, a little bit too much of a deus ex machina for me at the end, involving like one of the stories Nick was chasing. But that aside, I really enjoyed this book. I really enjoyed these two, and it was kind of a refreshing change of pace from what I normally gravitate to. And I will be interested to see what this means for Cat Sebastian. Like, is she going to start exploring different time periods, or are we going to see her move back into that more like traditional like Regency or Victorian historical like English setting? Very interested to see where she continues to explore. Was happy to see her branch out here and was pleasantly surprised. And with that, that was my July. Nothing too shabby, but we have entered the part of the year where I'm really staring down all of the books that have come out this year that I still need to read, and it is stressing me out a little bit, like in the sense that I do want to read all of these books and I have not read all of these books. So that is part of the reason I've done the spottier feature Fridays the last couple of weeks, between just like looking at the TBR and navigating, you know, work and social life on top of that. So there is a lot yet to come this year. I am excited to continue to dive in to new books with you all and to just see where the rest of the year takes us. So with that being said, let me know what you read this month, what you absolutely loved, if you've read any of the books I talked about today and what you thought of them. Just let me know what you're thinking. Like, subscribe, comment as your heart desires, but as always, thank you so much for hanging out. Read something good, and yeah, bye.